Today joining me is David Carroll, who has been in the Chattanooga area involved in radio and television for over 40 years. He's the author of the new book called Hello Chattanooga. I've read it and it's really good. So I really appreciate you coming.
My pleasure.
I'll be honest, I'm a little starstruck. My wife is one of your biggest fans.
And yet she's not here.
She's not here.
Must not be that big a fan.
Well, I'm not sure. She knew you were coming, but I don't know what, she's not real schedule oriented.
I'd heard she was a big fan. I thought maybe there'd be cake, but that's all right. Maybe I'll get to come back.
Speaking of cake, I saw where they had the your 30th, was it your 30th birthday party?
Or 30th anniversary.
30th anniversary.
5 years ago. Yeah.
Isn't that something? Does it seem like yesterday?
It really does. I think about it a lot because as you get to the end of your career, when you know the end of your career is much closer than the beginning of your career was, you start thinking about just how quickly it's all gone by. And it's just hard to believe.
Do you remember the day you were driving to Chattanooga? Now, see, where are you originally from? Was it
Bryant, Alabama, which is about 30 miles southwest of Chattanooga, up the mountain from Trenton, Georgia. So, you know, I grew up in the country, but our TV and radio and newspaper was all out of Chattanooga, so that was my town.
And really, that's all. Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama are so intermingled right in that corner that it's almost the same thing, isn't it?
It is, and the book I did prior to this was called Volunteer Bama Dog, which is named after the nicknames of the three states. I did a story about the one place you can stand on the borders of Dade and Marion and Jackson counties, Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama. You can stand in one spot, you know, and be in all three states at the same time. And when I did that, I just thought, man, this is my favorite three states, and my left foot is in, you know, North Georgia, and my right big toe is in Alabama, and the heel's in Tennessee. You know, I love it.
Is there a marker or a stake or what is it?
Right,
What
it's
does it
just
look like?
kind of a little gold plaque, you might say, that someone who did the surveying figured out where the three states meet. And there aren't that many of them in the nation, you know, where there are a few places where 4 states meet or 2 states meet and 3. But that's our little
Isn't there one out in Arizona somewhere? Or
I think it's the Four Corners.
the Four Corners, yeah.
Yep.
Boy, that is really something, how they determined where the states end and all of that stuff.
And that was part of the story, was that that marker and that line is actually wrong because it was done by a surveyor back in 1818, and all he had to use was the sun, moon, and stars, so he kind of estimated where the state line should be when I believe it was Alabama became a state. And it's actually wrong. It's the correct marker, according to today's technology, is in the Tennessee River, about 5 miles east of that, which is why Georgia has been trying to get Tennessee's water all these years. They rightfully have they actually have a right to it, but that would just upend all sorts of property lines and cause all kinds of chaos.
Boy, that really would do it, wouldn't it?
But that's been kind of one of the running jokes for years, in that every 5 or 10 years, some state legislators in Georgia will go to court trying to get that state line changed so they'll have access to Tennessee's water. Needless to say, Tennessee fights it and usually wins.
That would mess everything up, from your mailing address to your zip code to your voting precincts to everything.
So yeah, that's one of my favorite little stories, though. When you think about some surveyor 200 years ago who didn't have modern day instruments.
He was eating a sandwich.
He gave it his best shot. You know, put a line in the sand. We've been living with it ever since.
And to me, that's where it is.
Yeah.
You know,
and where it'll always be.
Bama Dog.
Bama Dog. Volunteer Bama Dog. That was the title of that book. Because I feel like I'm part of all three states.
Well, sure.
Grew up in Alabama.
Sure.
Lived in Tennessee now for the last 30 years. and I'm in Georgia every day for one reason or another. So yeah.
Do you remember the day you were driving to Chattanooga for your job?
Well, the job, there's a lot of different ways to put that. I remember the first time I skipped school in 11th grade to apply for a radio job in Tennessee. When I was in 11th grade, I finally talked a little radio station in South Pittsburgh into putting me on Sunday afternoons. That was my goal from the time I was about 12. I wanted to be a disc jockey. My parents had a store, kind of a country store, rural store, selling gas, groceries, paint, hardware, tires, TVs, you name it. And it's what I grew up in from the time I was about 5. But I became a real radio fan about the time I was 12. And starting then, I just, would see all these hard-working people come into our store who worked for TVA projects and sawmills and flour picking and potato picking. I mean, folks would come in, sweating and grimy and sometimes missing a finger because they'd cut off a finger, with a chainsaw. And I just thought, that's not what I want to do. And then I would watch TV and see somebody like Bob Barker on The Price is Right, all dressed up. And I'd see all the newsmen all dressed up. And, they had all their fingers, and these guys were put together and they're having fun. Bob Barker was standing there giving away prizes, and women were running up on stage to hug him. Yeah. And I thought, man, that beats working at a sawmill. Yeah. So my goal was to always get in broadcasting. And from the time I was 12, I would start basically badgering all these disc jockeys that I would hear on the radio. I would call them and just say, how do I do what you do? And they would say, you need to work on your Southern accent, you need to read, you need to, study English and history and politics and all that. So that was my goal. So I did talk a little radio station in South Pittsburgh into giving me a chance on Sunday afternoons to play rock and roll music. And I had been on that station.
You were in what grade were you in?
11th grade. And I was doing that for about 8 or 9 months. And I had become really good. And I know that because my mother told me I was good. Both my sisters told me I was good. And the other 11th graders at my school told me I was good. And I figured, all those people can't be wrong. Yeah. I must be good. So I took a tape of myself, skipped school, drove to Chattanooga like you asked, stopped in at WFLI, which was the top 40 powerhouse 50,000 watt radio station that I idolized. And I remember I took my tape in there of my Sunday afternoon shows in South Pittsburgh, handed them to the program director. And as he was putting the tape on the machine, I remember thinking, I wonder if he's ever heard anybody this young and this good. I wonder if he's ever heard an 11th grade 16-year-old who is this amazing.
He's going to just fall down with joy.
Well, I was thinking, who are they going to fire to make room for me? Because obviously I'm good. And so he put the tape on the machine, and after every one of my little segments, playing a record or whatever, he would stop it and just chew me out for how terrible I was, how I was using cliches, and I wasn't using my natural voice, and I was just kind of lazily, I'd say, ladies and gentlemen, da 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 da. He'd say, you're stupid. You're not talking to ladies and gentlemen, some big audience. You're talking to a person. You have to relate to a person, listening in their bedroom, their kitchen, their car. You said the late, great Elvis Presley. What, you don't think people know he's dead? They know. He just, on everything I said, he would stop and make fun of me or chew me out. And after about 5 little segments, maybe lasting a total of 2 minutes, he rewound the tape, handed it back to me and said, you work on those things I told you and come back and see me in a year. And Dee, when you're 16, a year is a long time. And I remember walking out of that building thinking, what does he know? Everybody else says I'm good. What's his problem? But the more I thought about it, I realized, he's right. I do all those things, and I could improve on that. And I could stop doing some of those things and do better radio broadcasts. And so I did work on it, and it took me a few months to come to the realization of that was probably the best thing that ever happened to me, and that he was the first person who was ever honest with me. And he was honestly trying to help me and make me improve. And sure enough, a year later, I went back, put on another tape, and was hired.
Same guy?
Yeah. But that's, that's one of the best lessons I ever learned, though, in that nowadays I'm the one who mentors or sometimes interviews young people who are looking for work, and they'll show me their video newsreel tape of what they've done. And I always say, now, do you want me to be nice to you, or do you want me to be honest with you? And most of the time they'll say, be honest with me. And I say, okay, now some of this may hurt your feelings, but I'll say something here that might make you better. And because that's how I got better.
Do you think that some of the stuff he told you was correct, or would you go back and say, that some of that stuff he told me was not exactly correct?
I think all of it was correct. I do. Because some of the people that I was listening to and copying myself after weren't necessarily that good. But sometimes when that's the only standard you have, you raise yourself up to that particular bar and think that's as high as you need to go. He was trying to make me better than that and trying to raise that bar for me and say, you can be, you don't have to be acceptable. You can be very good. And that's been my goal ever since, is to try to broadcast in a way that's, above that bar.
It is a skill, isn't it?
It's harder than it looks. You try to make it look easy or sound easy if it's radio. You want people, when they're watching the news, for example, if something goes wrong behind the scenes, you can either sit there and look into the camera and freak out and say, everything's going wrong, the teleprompter isn't working, and there's nobody at that live shot, and I can't hear any audio in my ear, and let's just go to a commercial. Or you can kind of finesse your way through it, keep that eye contact, continue talking, ad lib, tell what you know, and hopefully make enough sense and spend enough time to where after 30 seconds has passed, some of those things have been corrected and you can move on to the next thing. And the goal is to make the people watching at home never know that anything was wrong. That's the goal, not always achieved.
Now, you're more used to live stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can't, like playing an electric guitar, you make a mistake, everybody knows it, I guess.
Sure. Mm-hmm. And live, there's something about live to this day that I like. That's how I started in radio. And in that era of radio, you couldn't record ahead of time. I mean, the technology didn't exist where you could pretend you were hearing a song that, nowadays that's kind of the norm. But at that time, everything was live, and records could skip, records could run out, you'd have dead air, commercials would fail to play, machines wouldn't work. I mean, anything could go wrong. So over a period of time, I tried to develop those skills to where I could hide those mistakes. And you also develop a sense of timing. At that time, for example, you had to hit network newscasts at an exact time.
Yeah.
It might come on at 4:55:00 or 5:00:00, and you couldn't have 10 seconds of dead air going into it. You didn't want to go into it missing the newscaster's first 5 or 10 seconds. You were supposed to hit it at that moment. And I took a lot of pride in trying to do the math, figure out when a commercial or song or whatever would end so that I could hit that time on the clock. And with TV, similar things. Many times we'll go live to a reporter who's covering, a tragedy in Los Angeles, and he's going to start talking at 5:01:00. So radio helped me develop that sense of timing to where I would say just enough leading up to it, but not too much. And that's part of the joy of being live, though, is just that challenge of doing something right. And if you do it right, everybody sees it. You screw up, everybody sees it. It's kind of a nice challenge. I don't have a lot of athletic ability. I don't have a lot of, I can't fly an airplane or build an engine. Those are skills I don't have. But that's a skill that I have, and I try to do that well.
Did you work at the store that your parents had?
Mm-hmm. My dad was an engineer at Arnold Engineering in Tullahoma, Tennessee. And about the time he got to be 40, he was one of those guys who just felt like he was burned out. Had to work a lot of hours, long hours, sometimes all-night hours. And so I'm told he didn't like his boss. I mean, again, I'm 5 years old, so I don't know what that story was. But he was at a point in his life where he wanted to be his own boss. And he decided that a little grocery store there in the community in which we lived was up for sale, and that was going to be his ticket to being his own boss. As I used to remind him much later after that, yeah, you don't have one boss anymore. Everybody who comes in the door is your boss now, because the customer is always right, as I was told hundreds of times. But nevertheless, he got to have his own business. I grew up in it, and that helped me a lot in my current career, because when you're 5, 6, 7, 8 years old and you're learning to, run a cash register or pump people's gas or carry out their groceries, whatever, you never meet a stranger. It's like strangers are coming into your home all day long, and you better be nice to them and better be able to talk to them.
You had to learn to interact with them.
Right, and between that and my love of television, because that's what I would do when I wasn't in the store, that I think kind of encouraged me to be outgoing. I was such a brat of a kid, because watching TV game shows and then coming in to run the cash register and add up people's groceries, I was like this high, and I'd be adding up people's groceries and handing the lady the receipt saying, "Congratulations, your grand total is $7.22. And, my parents would be like, "Shh, it's not a game show." I'm like, I want it to be. But that helped kind of draw me out, I think.
Do you think that, do you have any classes or courses in being a disc jockey or a radio guy, or
No.
You just had a passion?
A passion. And unfortunately, sometimes imitation, I guess, becomes the route that you take to get into radio, because you're hearing your heroes, disc jockeys at that time, and I would hear the Chattanooga disc jockeys, who generally most of them took the same route I did. They would start out in a Dalton, Cleveland, South Pittsburgh, Calhoun, Athens. If they had some success there, they would take a tape of themselves to the bigger city, Chattanooga, with the bigger stations and larger reach, and get hired there. And many of them, if they succeeded in Chattanooga and they wanted to advance to Nashville, Atlanta, Indianapolis, that was sort of the route up. For me, I would hear them, the Chattanooga disc jockeys, and at night I would hear my all-time favorite radio station, WLS in Chicago, which was a clear channel AM station that after the sun went down reached 38 states. So living 30 miles out of Chattanooga, I would lose the Chattanooga station's signal at sundown when their power was cut. They went to a nighttime signal that just covered the city. But I could hear these out-of-town radio stations like the one in Chicago and some others from around the nation that were clear channel. The FCC gave them the ability to transmit around the nation. And, the Chicago disc jockeys were amazingly good. I mean, that's how they got there. And so I never took any classes or went to any schools to be a broadcaster, but I feel like those night after night after night, when I'm 11, 12, 13, 14 years old, listening to some of the best broadcasters in the field that I wanted to be in, some of that surely rubbed off, and goodness knows I stole a lot of their traits and styles, because I wanted to be them.
Did you ever watch WKRP in Cincinnati?
I did. That came on the first year that KZ106 was on the air, which I was the first person on that station. So it was kind of timely for me. I was about 21, and KZ was the first FM top 40 station in Chattanooga. And I remember when I got moved to that station from an AM station, I was doing mornings on WGOW AM, and the new owners came in and said, "We're going to turn KZ106 into a rock and roll station. We're going to turn that frequency into a rock and roll station, and we want you to switch over there." And at the time, I thought it was a demotion, because nobody was listening to FM at that time. AM was king. And I was kind of depressed about that. And then around that time, partially thanks to WKRP and just more people getting FM radios in their cars, there was this huge, move from AM to FM, people were suddenly realizing the music sounded better. You'd hear it in stereo, signal was more powerful. So WKRP kind of coincided with my move to that kind of format.
Johnny Fever emulated that era of disc jockey perfect, didn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, that was you.
Well, he reminded me of the older guys that I worked with, because at that time I was about 20, 21 years old, and I had been doing radio full-time for 2 or 3 years. But there were some guys at my station and at competing stations who were like Johnny, maybe in their 30s or 40s, who had that kind of burned out look and appearance and style, did too much, smoked too much dope,
Right.
Just crazy in their personal life,
A little
and
bit
professional
shaggy
life.
hair.
Yeah, just kind of strange individuals.
Yeah.
But he reminded me of a lot of people that I worked with.
A lot of people like that Johnny Fever personality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was iconic for that time, and that show was written in large part by the former program director at WQXI in Atlanta, who so many of those stories that you saw in WKRP came from real life.
It seemed like it was, because it was too close to reality.
We had so many things that show had. You have kind of a nerdy news director and a flashy sales manager, and good-looking receptionist, and
And the boss, the guy that owned the station by accident.
Clueless boss.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was must-see TV for us.
Now I saw your relationship to, say, Luther in the Morning. Was he? Would you say that he was a mentor or?
Yeah. In my early career, not so much. In fact, he was competition. And during that time when I was in my 20s and he was in his 60s, I was, in a way, sort of the sacrificial lamb they put on in the mornings, because, frankly, a lot of people didn't want to work in the morning because there wasn't a lot of listeners in that pie after Luther took his share. Luther, at that time, was at his peak. He was in his 60s, had been on the radio 40 years, and even though he didn't play, young people's music, many young people at that time were kind of like captive listeners, because that's what Mama and Daddy had on in the morning when they woke up. That's what Mama and Daddy had on the car on their way to school. So, like I say, you take, say, Luther having 50 or 60% of the audience in the morning, the rest of us, we're just trying to carve up our share of that remaining 40 or 50%. So in the beginning, I was a little resentful, even though I didn't know him. I just remember thinking, he's finding lost dogs. He's playing music by Guy Lombardo and, all these artists
Glenn
who
Miller.
are dead, Why aren't people listening to me? I'm playing, the current hits, and I'm telling all the cool jokes and making fun of the news, and, And gradually over the years, I got a little niche of the audience that, became respectable. But after I got into TV, I worked at the same station as him. I did TV, he did radio for a few years in the 80s. And then in his older years, once I did a couple of books and did a little research on him and really started appreciating who he was and what he had done over this unprecedented career, he became a real friend, a hero, somebody I still think about every day. I mean, I've still got his voicemails on my phone. He's never going away to me. But he is, I've never met anybody like him. There's never been anyone else in my profession who accomplished what he did worldwide. Think about it. Somebody who worked same time, same station from the time he was 19 until his death at age 92. Name me any profession, much less broadcasting.
And I believe he changed tires before he started doing that, right? Didn't he work at a gas station?
Yeah,
it wasn't like he had formal training.
He had no training. He was like me in the sense that he was a kid with a dream. And, I wasn't there in 1939, 40 when he was in high school, but at that time there were 2 radio stations on the air in Chattanooga, and I guess his parents had the radio on a lot, and he really admired those guys. There was a guy named Chuck Simpson on WDOD. I still have just a brief recording of him somebody gave to me from 1940, but he was the man at that time. And he broadcast in the morning, and he had this strong, clear voice, and he played, these marching band songs and Broadway show hits that were very peppy and uplifting and just very cheery. And Luther later admitted that that's what he wanted to be. He wanted to be like Chuck Simpson. And Chuck at that time, keep in mind Chattanooga was a small town compared to now, but had 2 radio stations, and this one guy was the man. Everybody knew him. I mean, people named their pigs after him. He was at every grand opening. When he got a speeding ticket, it was on the front page of the paper. I mean, Chuck Simpson was more famous than the man. And he was as famous as those other people that people heard on the radio. They heard him on the same radio. They heard Bob Hope and Jack Benny and Will Rogers, and so he was that big. So that was Luther's role model. And the way Luther was discovered, he was working for Bill Penny's service station on Dodds Avenue, and they had an intercom system, I guess a kind of a primitive intercom system that someone could get on a little speaker and tell people when their car was ready from being serviced or their tires being changed or whatever. And Joe Engel, who was the owner of the Lookouts and the namesake of Engel Stadium, and also the owner of this new radio station that was about to go on the air New Year's Eve 1940, was at the station one day getting some work done on his car, and this 17, 18-year-old kid working there, Luther Massengill, gets on the intercom and says, "Mr. Engel, your car is ready. Mr. Engel, your car is ready." And Joe Engel said,
"What are the odds?
Young man, you've got a nice voice. Would you like to come and try out and read some commercials? I'm about to put a radio station on the air." And that's how it started.
What are the odds of that?
I know. I mean, he could have been out sick that day, or
and not needed tires.
Mm-hmm. But it was meant to be. And he was just truly one in a million, once in a lifetime.
You regret that you didn't get to know him more when you were earlier on?
Yeah, that would have been fun because years afterward I started writing about him and interviewing him, kind of paying tribute to him as he would notch his 60th anniversary or 70th anniversary and all that. And it was always fun to hear his stories. But yeah, I really didn't. I guess he was about 65 when we started working in the same building. And so for about 4 years, I got to see him every day and just kind of watch him in action and just see the magic in how he communicated with people. I asked him one time, what's your secret? I mean, why are you Luther and the rest of us are the rest of us? And he said, I really don't have a secret. He said, if there's anything, I've learned that it's not the music you play, because, we all have the same records. You might play rock and roll, I might play soft music, the guy down the street plays country music, but we all play music. And we all play commercials. But it's what you do to help people between those records and those commercials. And that was his secret, because in his heyday, you never heard 2 songs in a row. You never heard 2 commercials in a row. Between every event was Luther doing something for the community. Might be as simple as my friend Dee has lost his Cocker Spaniel. If you see a Cocker Spaniel roaming around Cleveland, call so forth and so on, play a commercial. That ends. His next thing is Stewart Elementary School's having a bake sale. They're trying to raise money for a new football field. It's going to be this Saturday at noon. Play a commercial. But every time he had a chance to talk, he was trying to be a part of the community and help people. And the rest of us were just trying to be funny or clever, but he knew how to really touch people.
He would also sort of, in his talking, you'd sit back and say, Was that a commercial?
And that's his genius.
And you really weren't sure if it was a commercial.
And
Does that make sense?
And the rest of us weren't allowed to do that because the formats were so tight. They wanted us to play hit after hit after hit. Luther was given the freedom, and frankly, he had the smarts to know that he could be an effective spokesperson for any number of businesses. And he would do it so cleverly that you wouldn't know it was a commercial, and it was still entertaining. He'd be doing say he'd be talking to his traffic reporter. Jimmy, what's going on out there? Well, Luther, it's raining this morning, and we want to ask people to slow down. There's a fender bender over here at Rossville Boulevard and Central Avenue. And Luther would follow that up with, Jimmy, that's a good point. Just yesterday, I was over at Coker Tire, and Harold Coker noticed that one of my tires was starting to get a little slick, and he put one of those new Goodyear steel-belted radials on there. Really holds the road. And I don't notice any slipping at all. All right, it's 15 minutes after 7. And again, you're just sitting there like, whoa, was that a commercial? Yeah, but you were listening to it. You didn't switch away.
And the next week you think, I need tires. Maybe you don't even realize it was that he put that in your head last week.
Just brilliant. And he wasn't trying to be deceitful or anything like that. He just knew that was effective, and he wouldn't endorse anything he didn't really use or like, He really did have those tires on his car.
Some people have a recognizable, calm voice. He had that, and I'll say you had that also, or still have it.
Thanks. Certainly nothing compares to him. To this day, I can hear him. No one has ever sounded like that, and he didn't. Sometimes you'll meet people in broadcasting, and they sound a certain way, and then you'll meet them in person.
And they're different,
They don't sound like that. Luther, that's who he was. I mean, he was just being himself.
And we don't particularly care for people that are like that in life anyway. They act one way now and another way up. We want them to be the same person.
True, and a lot of us who idolized, whether it be politicians, broadcasters, whoever it might be in the public eye, and then we meet them and they're not friendly to us, or we may witness them in a moment of being petulant or angry at someone. I mean, remember that forever. I mean, to this day, I remember a sportscaster and a weather person, one in Atlanta, one here, who I just saw briefly in just moments in public events where they weren't at their best, and that's the only impression that I had. So yeah, you've got to be very careful.
It's unfortunate, but it's the reality, isn't it?
Yeah, but Luther, gosh, I have so many memories of going into restaurants to have lunch with him. I was telling somebody the other day who didn't know him or didn't know who he was, and I said, I walked into this restaurant, maybe one or two people either knew me or thought they did or waved or nodded. That's nice. I said, 10 years ago, I could have walked in here with Luther, and it would be like a circus came to town. Everybody wanted to touch him, hug him, have their picture taken with him. I mean, that's just a whole different level.
Did y'all ever eat at Nicky's?
Often.
I miss that place.
I miss Nicky's terribly.
Oh, I miss it. Every time I left there, I'd eaten so much I was sick.
Yep, I tried to limit it to cheeseburger and fries because if I got started on the shrimp and onion rings.
Oh, those onion rings, man.
They'd have to take me to the ER.
I always put mine in. I always dipped my onion rings in French salad dressings. Boy, that made them good.
But that's just one of those.
Why did they go out of business? I guess the pandemic, was that about the time, or was it?
Well, it was that may have played a role. It was right around the time the pandemic started, but I think it was inevitable. It's one of those businesses that got passed down a generation or two, and I think the most recent owner was nearing retirement age and really didn't have anybody in his family who wanted to take over. That combined with the fact that I think they got a pretty attractive offer from someone for the land to build condo or something there, condos. But yeah, that's one of those places you can't replace.
If you went there on a Friday around 5:30, you could forget it.
Yeah.
You wasn't getting in.
And if someone, I'm sure if someone had the wherewithal or the desire to continue it and enhance it, they could have, but evidently they didn't.
They had a rhythm about them that I don't know if anybody else could. I mean, they didn't even have big bathrooms. You didn't have anywhere to park.
No.
there was not hardly any seating. Everybody had to sit up front. There wasn't anywhere to sit up front. You couldn't stand up front. But I guess it was just good fried food.
Good fried food, consistent, reliable, and it was one of those places that someone could visit from out of town, and you'd say,
I got to show you this place.
they'd say, "Where's something that I can't find anywhere else?" Because you can go to Chili's anywhere. Well, let me take you to Nicky's. And
Hey, when they'd bring that big bowl of those onion rings, it was like a Christmas present, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
I don't know anywhere you can buy them like that anymore, do you?
No, and I was thinking of their cheeseburger just a day or two ago because it was the one and only.
And shrimp.
And
You'd order 6 and you couldn't eat but 4.
Well, and you see them make the burger.
Butterfly shrimp.
Butterfly shrimp.
Yep.
You see them make the burger, fresh ground beef right there, made right in front of your eyes.
I can still hear that spatula hitting that grill.
And saw some of the same employees there, year after year, decade after decade.
And the little Cokes. They had the little Cokes.
Nothing tastes better than a 6.5 ounce glass bottle Coke. I don't know how or why.
It's made different.
It's the best.
It's got to be made different.
It's just like a little shot of life right there.
Let me ask you this. We mentioned Rossville Boulevard. And as we talk about that, we don't realize that that was after Ross's Landing.
Mm-hmm.
That was incorporated Chattanooga in 1830 or 40. And fast forward less than 200 years, and look at Chattanooga.
Oh. I just feel blessed to be a resident there. I feel blessed that around the time my kids were growing up in the 90s and the 2000s is when everything went boom with the aquarium and the river park and Coolidge Park and the IMAX and the new baseball stadium, the new football stadium. I mean, I think Chattanooga got a little flat in the 70s and 80s, kind of making that transition from manufacturing to more advanced technology, putting a little more emphasis on tourism. But right around the time the 90s came and some of those improvements came to fruition and became a reality, as I say, it was right when my kids got to be 5, 6, 7 years old. I mean, you couldn't ask for anything better. It's fantastic.
Wonder what we attribute that to. Is there any one person or any group or just timing?
I think a lot of people, timing, and frankly, just the whole thing of the type of manufacturing that Chattanooga used to do was beginning to fade out anyway. There were a lot of people concerned about air pollution, which had given Chattanooga a really black eye 50 years ago. So I think it was the vision of a lot of people and just kind of the perfect storm of the right people coming together at the right time. Jack Lupton making sure a big chunk of his fortune went into the aquarium in his later years of life. Had that not happened, had he died younger, who knows where we would be. But that aquarium, I think, was the spark plug that really set everything off.
I noticed in your book, Hello Chattanooga, this was a lot of work.
4 years.
I don't know how you got it done in 4 years. That's how much information is in this.
My wife will tell you that she saw the back of my head for many years because I was on the computer, she was doing whatever she would do, watch TV, read, and all that. It was a hard book to do because there's so much data in there, and I didn't want it to be all data, dates and times and all that, so a lot of work with pictures, stories to kind of, add to the pictures and the data. But there were so many times during the 4 years where I would get to a point and run into a roadblock of being unable to get information from a needed source to fill in these blanks of Memorial Auditorium, 100 years of dates, Tivoli, 100 years, Lake Winnepesaukah, 100 years, all the others. So, you're trying to gather and make it as complete as possible as far as who has visited Chattanooga, who was a president, a military figure, movie stars, concerts, people who were involved in athletics, golfing, baseball, you name it. And with It started out as a history of Memorial Auditorium. And every time I would gather more information, I'd say, well, I got to include the Tivoli too, because they're basically sister venues. And you've got to include the UTC Arena, and you've got to include Lake Winnie, and you've got to include Ingle Stadium. And so one chapter became 15. And there were so many times during that 4 years where I would just run into, I'd be the coyote running into that mountain and just, can't go any further. And so for, 2-3 months, sometimes I'd just be on hold, like, I don't know how or if I'm going to get this finished. And it took a lot of determination, and I hate to say this, but it would probably not have gotten done without the pandemic, because that changed my work life for a good while. I was at home a lot doing newscasts from home, and frankly had more free time on my hands than I used to because we couldn't go anywhere. So that was the first real opportunity that allowed me to focus on getting that done. I couldn't go out and do news stories. I couldn't go to my workplace, even though I was still employed there and broadcasting from home. But I had more hours in the day to really do nothing but that book. And again, I can't say anything good about the pandemic. It sucked, but that's really about the only thing that allowed that book to get done.
Let me tell you about Capstar Bank. They're located in Nashville, Hendersonville, Gallatin, Athens, Madisonville, Sweetwater, Etowah, and in Cleveland at 950 25th Street and 3855 North Ocoee Street. I've used them. I like them. Give them a try. They're no problem. Well, I know you have a lot of dates in here of entertainers, and it's interesting to hear about all of that. But what I was reading through it is more the history. Here's what I got out of it: the history of entertainment industry in Chattanooga.
Pretty much, that's the theme.
And it's in there. It would mention the street fairs they used to have in 1896, I believe it was.
Right.
So would that have been the forerunner to the River Bend?
In a way, and I think as long as civilization has existed, you've had groups of people who will find a way and a place to entertain. Going back to Greek theater or whatever, you're always going to have someone.
What is it in human nature that wants that?
I'm one of them.
Fill the void, or
if on my way out of here tonight, if there's 3 people on the side of your street, picking and grinning, I'll stand and watch. I just think that's, I think we all have that desire to be entertained, that need to be amused. And in those early days, like you say, before there was a Ingle Stadium, there was an older ballpark before that. Before there was Memorial Auditorium, there was a City Auditorium. Before there was many of the other performing venues, there were churches that would have singings and gatherings. There was a little place in Ringgold that hosted hillbilly hoedowns back in the 30s and 40s, long before any of these venues we have now were available. So that was one thing that was very. I guess something I enjoyed in doing the book. I knew from my lifetime what had been at Memorial Auditorium, say, since the 60s and 70s. And I was at the UTC Arena the first night it opened on the 80s. I've seen the entire history of that. I've been to Lake Winnie many times as a kid, 60s and 70s, and saw that. But what I loved learning was, what came before those places. Who was here in the 1890s, the Wild West shows.
Yeah, that's what
the actors that I would hear about when I was a kid who were even dead then, the Sarah Bernhardts and, the Carradines and the other, names that go back more than a century. But they were all here. Chattanooga for being, never being considered, Chicago or an LA or anything like that. Because of our railroad hub, we were a stop along the way for people going from one part of the country to another. And that could be entertainers, politicians, baseball teams, but they stopped in Chattanooga. Chattanooga Choo-Choo didn't get its notoriety for nothing. We were a huge railroad hub, and so many times we attracted these big names for two reasons. Number one, being a railroad hub and being a stop where many people would stop here and spend the day playing ball or doing a show. And frankly, the other is just what I call Chattanooga's old money. There are quite a few instances in the book where you read about President Franklin Roosevelt, where you read about Arnold Palmer, Jack Nicklaus, tennis stars from 40, 50, 70, 80 years ago, the biggest names in tennis, Bobby Riggs, Don Budge, everybody since then. And that old money that Chattanooga had, the Coca-Cola money, the bank money, the mill money, that sort of thing, these very wealthy people would invite presidents, golfers, tennis players, prominent entertainment figures to come here, spend the night, and pay for it. The big names of that time, it was nothing for them to say, for them to call, a Sam Snead or some golf superstar and say, come and play at the Chattanooga Golf and Country Club. We'll pay your plane fare. We'll take care of your meals, your hotel, do an exhibition for us. But that Chattanooga money attracted some people that, maybe Knoxville and Savannah and other towns didn't.
And an easy way to get off at a railroad stop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a story. One of my favorite stories in the book. There's a picture and a story that has gone around for 91 years now of a 18-year-old girl named Jackie Mitchell who struck out Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig at an exhibition baseball game at Ingle Stadium the first year it opened in 1931. Now, I heard about that all my life. I saw her in newspaper clippings. I saw her interviewed on television in her later years. She always lived here. But I never really put two and two together. Okay, first off, why was there an 18-year-old girl pitching to Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig at Ingle Stadium anyway? How'd that happen?
Yeah.
And in doing the research for the book, I was born just a little too late for this. But in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, every year, first weekend of April, the major league teams would be on their way from Florida to their big cities. And there were no teams on the West Coast until the late 50s. So 1930s, 40s, and 50s, you had the New York teams, Philadelphia, Chicago, Boston, Detroit, St. Louis, whatever. And they all trained in Florida in March, spring training. Well, every March, they're all on the train going back up to New York, Detroit, so forth and so on. And every year, at least two of those teams stopped in Chattanooga and played an exhibition game at Ingle Stadium every year. So whenever, all these names that I heard of all my life, Joe DiMaggio, Duke Snyder, Ted Williams, everybody, Willie Mays, Jackie Robinson, they all played at Ingle Stadium at one time or another in these exhibition games, and they were always sold out. It was the biggest thing in town, and that's why the Yankees were here in 1931. They were here many other years too, but they were famous for that Jackie Mitchell exhibition game. But that was a great little thing for me to learn, because we've always heard of historic Ingle Stadium. Mm-hmm. Well, you're darn right it is. I mean, it was an absolute baseball palace for all those years.
It is really something how we don't, until I read this book, I did not realize that just about everybody had been in Chattanooga for a reason. Mm-hmm. Besides, the best I could tell, Elvis and Bill Clinton. Other than that, I believe everybody's been here.
Yeah,
I can't think of one that was not.
And Elvis was here, just never performed here. And if Bill Clinton was here, I don't know about it. But I think we've had 45 people serve as president of the United States. Biden is number 46, but one guy served twice, Cleveland. So out of those 45, I think it's now 28 of those presidents were here in Chattanooga. They're all documented in that book. And the fascinating part to me is not all of them came here during their term. You had some who were here during their military service.
Biden was here prior to his term, I
Right,
believe.
Biden, as early as when he was in his early 30s, he spoke to one of the Rotary clubs or something. But you had some who were here like Eisenhower, and I think he was in Fort Oglethorpe once, like way back when he was a young soldier. You had Civil War, Ulysses Grant, and some of the others who were here during the Civil War. You had some who were here after they were president. Had some like Jimmy Carter who were here bunches of times. FDR was here many times.
Bush was here.
Both Bushes were here.
Both Bushes.
Nixon was here when he was a young senator. John F. Kennedy was here when he was in his early 30s as a young senator. In many cases, that again goes back to that Chattanooga money thing. And I'm not saying that in a derogatory way. But when you think about Biden, Kennedy, Nixon, and many others I could cite from the book who appeared before some of the local civic clubs early in their career, there's a reason for that. I mean, Chattanooga's always had a ton of money, and a lot of those people would contribute to political parties. So for a young Kennedy, Biden, Nixon, Howard Baker, so many others who either became president or ran for president, part of the financial pipeline came through Chattanooga.
Was it in your book that mentioned the term Chattanooga is where cotton meets corn?
I don't recall using that one, but there's something to be said for that.
Because, you got the... So that's a reason why the railroad came, I guess.
That was a big part of it.
Maybe I didn't read that in that,
Yeah,
but I remember hearing that, I believe. But it is really astonishing that you've been able to, not only have you written about these, but you've actually met them. Can you think of anybody that you just, when you met them, a star like at 21 years old, who would have been the big star that you met early on?
Probably early on. Back then, when I was first getting into radio, I became the music director for some of these local radio stations at a fairly early age. And at that time, the record companies were, they had promoters for each label who would come to Chattanooga. And in order to get a radio station to play whatever record they happened to be promoting at that time, they would wine and dine the local disc jockeys and music directors and often give you a chance to meet those recording artists. And they would sometimes send these artists on the road to go to individual radio stations to ask you to play their songs. Because, let's face it, if, somebody like, I was trying to think of somebody that, if the Bee Gees, who were, struggling for a while in the 70s before Saturday Night Fever. I mean, if the Bee Gees are in town and you get free tickets to their concert and a chance to go backstage and they're like, would you play my latest record? I mean, you're going to say no to the Bee Gees?
No.
Come on. So, it's very ego flattering to be able to go up to somebody like a Kenny Rogers and, there's this shining star of a man who's, thank you for playing my records. I've got one coming out next month that I really think you'll like. I mean, when you're 20, 22 years old, that's
a little powerful, isn't it? It's kind of an ego trip, I guess, right?
A huge ego trip. And as I learned, though, it's very temporary because, you have that power, you think, in that position. And then the moment you take another job, like in my case, when I was 25 or 26, I switched to TV, which had nothing to do with playing records. And suddenly, those same record promoters wouldn't take my calls anymore because I was of no use to them.
I always think about that movie, Oh Brother, Wherefore Art Thou, when they went to that radio station and they sang in the can.
Yeah.
Remember, that was what you were. You were allowing them to sing in the can.
Pretty much. And what I love, and some of these stories are in the book, there was a local promoter who was the booker for Lake Winnipesaukee. And people sometimes make fun of Lake Winnie. But the fact is, for 97 years, almost continuously, they have provided a great amusement park for the people in this area. And for most of those 97 years, they have provided free Sunday afternoon concerts featuring the biggest names in country music. Now, granted, most of them are either people who are on their way up or people who are on their way down. They're not going to get Garth Brooks or Luke Bryan there today, but they get some big names anyway. And Jeannie C. Riley, back in 1968, was a nobody, and she's schlepping around all these different radio stations like WFLI here. This is a little before my time, but she and Gene go to that radio station with a copy of this new song she has called Harper Valley PTA, and hands it to Johnny Eagle, the program director. And I mean, it's kind of a country song, and yet FLI played rock and roll. But Johnny got to meet her, and she probably charmed him in some way or another. And they put it on the turntable, and that was the first station in the country to play what would become a #1 song. And that following weekend, Jeannie did her first live concert at Lake Winnie. And she had really one song, and I guess she faked a few others.
Yeah.
But, it's fun to go back and see how our little town and even places like Lake Winnie made a difference in someone's lives. Dolly Parton was the same way. She was at Lake Winnie unbilled one day. Like somebody else was playing, and she's a friend of the artist, and they're like, hey, y'all, if you'll hold on here a second while we tune our guitars, this little lady wants to come up and sing for you. Dolly Parton goes up on stage at Lake Winnie, probably 18, 19 years old. She's never forgotten it, but it's fun just to find those stories. One of the other things that I really enjoyed documenting for that book, whenever you go to a concert, there's a big name on the ticket. You bought that concert ticket because the Doobie Brothers are the headliners. Well, there's always an opening act, and most of the time you've never heard of that opening act. And that opening act who's warming everybody up for the big stars, that's when you come in, they're playing on stage, and you're finding your seat,
getting your
taking
popcorn,
your coat off, and you're talking to your neighbors. Nobody's paying attention to that poor soul on stage because we're waiting on the big star. And so I've got a whole section in there on people who were opening acts in Chattanooga that were unknown at the time. Celine Dion, Britney Spears,
Taylor Swift, 38 Special, I think you said.
Yep, Kenny Chesney. Kenny Chesney got some horrible review in the paper. He opened for Clint Black, and the next day in the paper, it was like, Clint Black was amazing. Clint Black did all of his hits. These instrumentalists were amazing.
Kenny Chesney really became bigger star than
he did.
Than him.
But that little thing in the paper that day said, also appearing was the opening act, Kenny Chesney, who looked like a 12-year-old boy wearing his daddy's 10-gallon cowboy hat. All it said. So I've told people, next time you go to a show, pay attention to that opening act. They may be tomorrow's big star.
Pay attention to the 16-year-old boy that's drove from Alabama to bring his demo tape.
Exactly. You never know who
You never know.
You never know. It was a joy, though, to John Goodman, who's been a TV star for years on Roseanne.
Yeah.
He's one of those guys.
And on Oh Brother, We're Far Out There.
He's in that too.
Isn't that funny?
You're right. He was one of those guys who was in a play at the Tivoli Theater back in the early 70s. Some play, and there were a couple big stars in it, and he was that guy who's, the third or fourth headliner. Nobody knew who he was, but there's a picture of him, So it's fun to dig up that kind of stuff.
Isn't it funny how people that seem to be in positions to be stars have that sort of luck that kind of goes with them? Mm-hmm. In other words, it's almost like written in the stars, which is, I guess, maybe where it gets the name. They're a star.
Right.
But do you think that all of these people we've mentioned, that they had unbelievable talents, or do you believe there's other people that have talents too, they just don't pursue it?
Well, there's some of that. I think the luck you said is a big part of it. I do a radio show now too, and one of the things that I research on that are the stories behind the hits. And every week, I've been doing this 7 years now, every week, I call my wife over and say, come here, you're not going to believe this. And I will find the original version of some big hit we all know and love. And sometimes it's not that good, but every once in a while, it's like, oh my God, this is great. I mean, this is better than the one we've been hearing on the radio.
Now, what do you mean version? Of the same artist or of an earlier artist?
Well, in many cases, it's usually another artist.
Like a Hound Dog for Elvis, that
Exactly.
movie, they had that.
Big Mama Thornton.
Big Mama
first
Thornton,
one who did it.
yeah.
And there are a lot of instances like that that aren't that well known, but you go back and either find that the first version was better, in some cases that the first version is just literally the successful artist ripped it off word for word, note for note. It's just like, and that first person just either didn't have the promotion, the record company push, timing, whatever it may be. I mean, sometimes a song may be a little bit out of its era, and it becomes more.
Well, that's very
applicable
true,
later.
isn't it?
But that kind of answers your question, and that so much of it is luck and timing. And you think of so many of these artists and people who were just, that close to getting that big break or that role or whatever that made someone else very wealthy.
It would be interesting to talk to some of these people that said, well, I was going to quit on Thursday, but on Wednesday, such and such happened, and I just went through the roof.
Oh, yeah. And I think of that.
It could be promotions.
In your career, my career, I mean, one of the things that I'll never forget is that at about age 19, I had done a little bit of radio, but I had decided to go back to college, major in business management. And even though I was not a huge fan of my dad's business, I knew it was profitable, knew it had a good future. I knew I could do it. It wasn't as fun and entertaining as what my dream was, but also, I was starting to think about money, and at that time wasn't making much money in radio, and thought, if I'm going to settle down and have a family someday, I'm going to need money. So long story short, I wanted to keep my little toes in radio on weekends or something as a hobby, but I had shifted my full-time goals to something more sensible. And so I was going to college at nights and working toward a business management degree. I was doing that for several months. Everything was going fine. That was on schedule. On a Thursday morning, the radio station that I was working on weekends for here in Chattanooga called, and the manager said, listen, our morning guy just resigned, and he's given us 1 day's notice. Tomorrow's his last day. Monday he starts in Birmingham. We just need somebody to fill in on mornings for a couple of weeks till we find somebody. And I thought, well, going to school at night, driving 40 miles to get there, working an early morning shift, I can suck it up and do it 2 weeks. So I told my dad, I said, for the next couple of weeks, I'm going to have to get up at 4 in the morning because we live 40 miles from Chattanooga and the whole thing. And he said, you can't do that. You've never gotten up early in your life. I said, well, it's just for 2 weeks. He says, what about college? I said, well, I know I get home about 10 o'clock, but I said, for 2 weeks I can do it. He said, you need to call them and tell them you're not going to be able to do it. And he wasn't doing any reverse psychology. He was just being honest. He's like, I don't think you have the physical ability to work here during the day at the store, drive to Rainsville, Alabama at night, drive to Chattanooga at 4 in the morning. Just tell them you can't do it. In my head, 18, 19 years old, I'm thinking, I'll show him. He says I can't do it. I can do it, which was stupid, but that's the 18-year-old brain thinking.
Thank goodness.
My dad just told me I can't do something. I'll show him. So I did it for 2 weeks, and whatever I did was acceptable enough to where they offered me the full-time job, which led to everything else that I've done since then. And so I think, what, if that guy, that former disc jockey, hadn't taken another job and given them 2 days' notice, if
he'd have given them 3 days' notice, they might have called somebody else.
They might have found someone else. Or had he been satisfied in Chattanooga and stayed there, whatever. But you look back at all these little things in your life that lead to something else, that turn into something permanent, and you realize there's something more powerful that's calling these shots.
I don't know if it's anything we do or if we're just supposed to be prepared when it comes about, but it couldn't be that. It's too much random circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, I think pretty much all of us in every walk of life can cite something as to who we marry, why we married them, why we didn't marry somebody else, all that stuff. But I look back at that stuff all the time.
I always think several times in my life, if I'd have took a left instead of a right, it might have been a disaster.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I'm the same way about job changes. A lot of people that I know can't handle a few months or a year or whatever of a difficult time at work. You know, if you don't like the boss, if you've been given a task you don't want to do, by golly, I'm going to take the first thing that comes along. And they do. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And I've had those situations at Channel 3. I've been there for 35 years. And I can think of at least 3 periods of time when I would have, you know, done just about anything to get out of there because I was unhappy for one reason or another. But each time, for whatever reason, thought it out, waited it out, things got better. And you know, I've told my kids from time to time when they get frustrated, you know, sometimes the best move you make is not making a move, the one you don't make. I mean, just wait things out, see what happens, don't pull the trigger too quickly. That's worked for me. It may not work for everybody.
Most mistakes I've made is I reacted too quick.
It can get you in trouble.
And not weighed out the odds and calm down a minute and see what's up.
And you have to suck it up sometimes and
you can't act on emotion. You have to act on rational thinking.
And that's one of those times where you have to sit on a rock somewhere and let your mind clear out. I've had to do that a few times.
Where would you sit on the rock at?
Cloudland Canyon State Park, Trenton, Georgia.
Now, let's think about that a minute. Isn't that where the mafia met?
I don't know about that.
At Cloudland Canyon?
Not sure. Could
Yeah,
happen.
isn't there a fancy restaurant there?
No, not that I know of. I think there may be somebody else.
I'm thinking Mont Eagle.
That's more like it.
Yeah,
that's it.
Yeah. Cloudland Canyon is where don't they have snow there? Or
No, you're thinking about Mentone.
Mentone. Yeah, Mentone.
Cloudland Canyon is just your good old basic Georgia State Park with a great trail, hiking trail, and waterfall. And about halfway down that trail.
Well, I had all that messed up, didn't I?
But you got some good stories. But now, about halfway down that trail is this big, flat rock under a boulder that you can just kind of sit on for a while. And there have been a couple of times in my life where I've gone there on a weekday with very few distractions and just sort it all out. That's my happy place.
You know, I had this dozer man one time. I was probably in my early 20s, and he was late. And I was trying to get him to the job, and he finally gets there, and he's working himself to death. This was during those periods when everybody was busy. And as soon as he got out of the truck, I said, "Hey, Buck, I need you to..." He said, "Dee," he said, "Lidland," he used to call me, he said, "Lidland, I just need to take a minute here if you'll just let me calm down." So I've learned from then, he was right, just calm down a minute. But that place in Cloudland Canyon, when you go there, is it like early morning, evening, or midday?
Midday. Yeah.
When it's just sunny enough?
Sunny. It's funny, in those days, and I'll go back, say, 20, 30 years when I had some of these life-changing moments where I needed to decide which way to turn. In those days, before the internet, it was, I won't say it was deserted, but it was peaceful. It wasn't a big attraction. And you could pretty much go there on, say, a Tuesday in the middle of June and have a bit of privacy. I've noticed the last few times I've gone there that there are visitors there from overseas, from every state. And it's certainly not crowded now, but it's busy many times of the year. And I think that's a direct result of, people who go online and their goal is to visit every state park or to explore, to hike, whatever. And people who, say, 20, 30 years ago may not have found it on a random map. Now, they search state parks or whatever, and they see the pictures and they say, I've got to go there. So I don't know that I'd have that same privacy today, but I used to.
Well, this place that you go, is it off the trail just a little bit?
Yeah, it's off I-59, and you've got to drive about 5 or 6 miles up Lookout Mountain. So it's not like, right off an interstate or anything. Certainly easily accessible, but yeah, not on the beaten path.
Nature will getting away with nature will help you think.
Mm-hmm.
When you went to those places, when you went to take those breaks, did you try to think about the situation or just not think?
No, I had decisions to make. There were in each of those instances. I mean, frankly, one of them was whether to stay in radio or switch to TV. Radio was my love. It was what I had done full time for 6 or 8 years. I was in my, what was I, about 26. I was about to get married. And, you know, to me at that time in my life, it was a big deal. What am I going to do with my life? What am I going to do for a career? You know, I'm about to start a family here. You know, I'm not a kid anymore. What if I fail in TV? Can I go back to radio? If I don't take this TV job, will I regret it years later? What are the pros and cons? The money, the hours, the responsibilities, all those questions. I think I even took a yellow pad or something and just kind of did kind of a pros and cons list. But that's something I don't think I would have done at home or at work because of the distractions of the presence. But there, it was just kind of like me and the sun and the rock and the scenery and
no outside influences like.
And the couple of times that I have used that particular place to make those decisions, so far I'm batting 1,000. If I had another tough one right now, so far. And if I had to make another one right now, that's probably where I'd go.
And you can't even really do that in your own backyard if you have a nice garden. You have to get away where there's nothing familiar.
Right.
Because familiarity will taint your thinking or tarnish it.
And that's just the kind of place where, again, there are no, you can't run to the restroom, you can't grab a Coke. I mean, it's just you're just there. So far that's worked well for me.
What you're not, or I guess I should say, you've mentioned sort of at the end of your career, but you're not old.
Getting there. I could retire, and I'm at the point in my life where if it's not rewarding and enjoyable, then I'm not going to do it. I mean, there were periods in my life 10 or 15 years ago where if it wasn't rewarding or enjoyable, I had to do it anyway because, you just had to meet certain responsibilities. But I'm fortunate to be at a time where I could and I can, but I'm very fortunate in that I work for a great company. And I would tell you this if we were talking privately or whether there's cameras on or not. As far as TV stations go, the business has become so different in the 35 years that I've been working in television and in radio. There was a time when the people who owned these stations in the Chattanooga area were mom and pop type. They were locally owned, locally operated. Every decision was made in that facility. Now that rarely happens. And the station I work for is owned largely by an individual and a company that is based in another state. But it is a small company, and the decisions that are made that pertain to my station are made in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And most of my competitors in TV and radio can't say that. So that has probably extended my career, and that I work for people I enjoy working for and with. I'm very blessed in that respect. I have some friends who've gotten out of the business in recent years who work for other employers who got out just for that reason, that they were not having fun anymore and they did not like their ownership and management. So far, I haven't had that problem.
And it's not necessarily the pay at that point. It's lifestyle and whether it meshes with your lifestyle, right?
Right. And, and especially when you've been at it as long as I have, you want to be happy. Going back to our friend Luther that we mentioned earlier, he had lots of ups and downs in his life and career and worked for different owners, even though he was at the same station for many times. He worked for the same station, but there were periods of time when ownership changed, management changed, of course. And he and I have one thing in common, and that is our love of broadcasting and trying to do it right. But his goal was to keep doing it forever, and he felt like it kept him young. I'm not going to be Luther. I'm not going to be on the radio or TV when
so
I'm 90.
So you say.
That's not going to happen. But I don't want to work all my life. And, hopefully I'll be blessed to have a good life after retirement. But my dad retired when he was in his early 60s and had about 20 more good years of life. So, yeah, I don't want to do it forever. But I am blessed to be doing it for a company that, if I had to do it forever, it would be a pleasant task.
It seems like that people that do work on seem to live longer. You notice that?
Well, and one thing that, for instance, one of the reasons that Luther kept going, when he turned 65, at that time, he was not, let me think about this for a minute. Walter Cronkite was a few years older than him. Walter Cronkite was born, I think, in 1915 or 16. Luther was born in 1922. But when Walter Cronkite turned 65, he was forced to retire from CBS. That was mandatory. Everybody did. Luther turned 65 a few years later, and around that same time, Bear Bryant, the famed Alabama football coach, retired and died a few months later. Harry Thornton, who was one of Luther's TV and radio colleagues, was a little bit older than Luther. He retired at 65, died about 3 months later. And I think whether there's any connection or not, in Luther's mind, he's thinking, well, I'm not going to retire then because I don't want to just die. I think both these other fellows probably had some pre-existing conditions that led to this. But I think in Luther's mind, he kept saying, if retiring, if that's what you get after you retire, I'm going to keep on working. And he liked working with young people. He liked being one of the guys. He liked being part of the pranks and part of the camaraderie that go into the broadcasting. And he liked to be treated like the 25 and 30-year-olds were. But I'm sure that's part of what kept him going as long as it did.
Well, I noticed people that seem to have a zest for living and doing whatever their job is, they seem to be more balanced mentally.
I'd have to go along with that. But, yeah, I guess to sum up, the employment situation, as long as you're working for people who respect your work and respect your what you've done and what you can still do, it's kind of hard to walk away from that. So I'm very fortunate in that respect. It's so rare these days to work for a broadcasting company where you work for somebody who knows your name, because so many TV stations and radio stations these days are owned by these large corporations who have, an outpost in every town, and you're just a number to them. And we often hear of people who get laid off, for financial reasons, but they may not know, what this person has done in that community or what that person may be facing in his or her life at that time. They just know that job number 22A in Columbia, South Carolina has got to be eliminated because we can fill it in with a 21-year-old who will do it for half the money. So I'm blessed in that I'm still working for a company that does not think that way.
Now, let me ask you this. You're familiar with all types of music.
A lot of them, not all, but yeah, some.
If you were to have to drive to Florida tomorrow and you had to pick one album, one CD, one artist, what would be your go-to?
If it were just one artist.
You had to be stuck with him for 5 hours.
Yeah. If I were going someplace like that, this would certainly not be the most deep thinking or meaningful type of music, but the Beach Boys would come to mind. Just something that would kind of keep a smile on my face.
Happy.
And, give me some nice memories and something to sing along to. I mean, a lot of people would probably answer your question with...
it would all be different.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody, it would all be the era that they were coming up in, that music.
And the Beach Boys were actually a little early for me, but I've just always... It's hard for me to switch away from a Beach Boys song if it comes on the radio, even if it's a rainy day. It's just one of those things where, for the next 2-3 minutes here, this is going to be fun. We're just going to ride the waves and drive the fast cars and look at the pretty girls and think about California, So that would probably be the first one that comes to mind.
Have you ever wondered this? Nowadays, or back then it was, or, and I'm probably messing this up, but back in the early, 1920, it was the vaudeville show. Am I saying that right? The vaudeville show.
Vaudeville, yeah.
And then towards the end of the 1800, it was maybe a magic show and that sort of stuff. And now we're in rock and roll. Country music had its era. But it's almost like the people that get the attention now are, artists, singing artists. But it's more people who get on the radio and can make good sound bites. A snippet about this political or that political or the, city council meeting so-and-so said such and such. Is that going to be the next thing because let's face it, if it weren't for advertisers, people really couldn't buy enough tickets to keep anybody going.
True.
I mean, unless you're an Elvis, and he might have had a good producer,
all right,
or a promoter. But is it possible that the next thing that people go for, or the next thing instead of the vaudeville show and disco, it's going to be who can give a good sound bite?
Could be. I worry a lot about where we're headed now. I had a guy stop me at outside a book signing not long ago. Seemed like a real nice fella, and I guess he is. But he said, "You're in the news business. Let me ask you this: why is it that your news station and the other news stations are slow to follow up on the real news that they're giving on Fox News?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, Fox News will have something that they've discovered, and they'll put it on, but nobody else picks it up. And then you all don't pick it up until a year or two later when it turns out to be true." And I didn't know exactly how to answer that. I knew what I wanted to say, but I can't say everything I want to say sometime. But I just said, all I can tell you is I hope that you'll watch a little bit of everybody to get your news. I hope you don't watch only one source, and I don't care which one it is, from this side, that side, or whatever, because everybody thinks the news stations are taking sides. But I said, please get your news from more than one source, because what I'm noticing, and I'm not sure I'm answering your question exactly, but I call it angertainment, in that.
Well, I hadn't heard that, but that makes sense.
It bothers me in that, let's say a certain channel or network is, that their main theme today is how high gas prices have gone up. And they will spend days and hours and weeks hammering that point of how everything's terrible because gas prices are up.
And the reasons.
And, that's certainly enough for us to get angry about. But now, for example, for whatever reason, gas prices are on the way back down. They're not as bad as they were 6-8 months ago. But those same people who were riling people up about that a few months ago, they can't talk about gas prices now.
You're not mentioning that now.
Because that's not it's not eliciting the anger that they need to keep people watching. They're finding something else, whatever it may be. But it's just unfortunate that today, unlike when I was growing up, you can't just inform people. And people sometimes say, Walter Cronkite, why aren't there people like him anymore who never expressed an opinion? Well, he did express opinions occasionally.
Yeah, and some people didn't like his opinion.
It got him, some hot water once or twice. But still, then compared to now, generally most of the news we got, magazines, newspapers, television, radio, most of them tried to inform. That was the goal. Investigate and inform. Now, so many of them, their goal is to make people angry, because that translates into ratings, which translates into revenue. And as a result, we have so many angry people now. And, I can't imagine pretty much any of the networks, opinion networks I call them, I can't imagine any of them now devoting their entire day to celebrating gas prices going down, because that's not going to make anybody mad. So we've got to find something, we've got to invent something that will make them mad. So
I've noticed also they'll have a story where they are a real sad story, and then a happy story, then a sad story, then a happy story. It's almost like sweet and sour thing, or eating something salty and then something sugary. Mm-hmm. It's I guess maybe they're just trying to get you to watch and react and tune back in but I'd really just like to hear the news if I'm going for the news, and I don't really care about their opinion.
Right.
And like you said, it's just opinion. There's just their opinions. And I can watch both the networks, and none of them are saying. I can watch something happen, and both of them will have it completely wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, but if you're not aware of that, they'll have you angry on both sides.
And one thing that worries me now, I don't know where our next generation, by that I mean high school students, college students, I don't have the scientific research to know exactly where they get their information. I do know that for most of them, it's not the 6 o'clock news as it was 50, 60 years ago. I mean, I'm grateful to still be doing that. I'm glad there's an audience for it. But it's certainly not the destination for many people as soon as they get home. It's a different world now. And what I'm fearing is that even at that young age, that they're being trained, they're being, training's not the right word. Conditioned to following certain people or organizations on Twitter, TikTok, whatever's out there right now, Instagram. A lot of people get their news from their device. And in the old days, you kind of could believe that if it was on ABC News, CBS News, NBC News, New York Times, you felt pretty confident that it was accurate. Sure, there might be a little investigative tinge into it. I mean, nobody delivered the news about Nixon and Watergate by saying, Richard Nixon, who's otherwise a really swell guy, got into a little bit of trouble last night. I mean, you've got to investigate when things go wrong. But by and large, we felt like that those news sources were trustworthy and had been vetted several times by several editors and overseers who were making sure that it wasn't fiction. I don't know now that our 15-year-olds, 16, 17-year-olds, where they're getting it, and they don't know the difference between an ABC News
they don't know.
And,
And they've got me confused about it too, almost.
It's worrisome.
Because they're really getting good at blurring the lines.
And, you and I could go out and invent a website tonight, and we could design a logo that's not terribly unlike the ABC logo. And, ABC in our world could stand for Al's Broadcast Company. And, it could be ABC News, Cleveland.com.
American Journalist.
Anything. But the point is, someone might see some of the fiction that we might concoct, and it's online, so it must be true. And there's a lot of that going around now, and I really worry about our kids.
I watch some of these things online, these places that are giving the news, and they'll have them sitting behind a desk, and it'll look so real, like it's a real news thing. And all of a sudden, they'll say something, and I'll say, well, that can't be true. I can detect that. Mm-hmm. But these, I don't know if young people can do that.
And I hope that if it's not being done, I hope more high schools will introduce some sort of curriculum along the lines of media literacy or something just to try to combat the misinformation that's going on out there. I mean, it may be too late for me, but I hope somebody can figure out a way to do that.
You could almost say they need a better bullshit detector.
Yeah, and it would go off a lot.
It would go off a lot.
It would go off constantly. You have to get new batteries for
But
it.
I think maybe that's the new form of entertainment, whereas it used to be Waylon Jennings.
Well, and it worries me sometimes that when I hate to keep going back to when I grew up because, you know, times weren't perfect then, but I do recall, you know, the soundtrack of my life growing up, what I would hear in the background, whether it be radio, TV, or just whatever, was pretty tame compared to what today's kids hear in the background, whether it be the songs they hear on the radio, the information that may be coming from mom and dad or grandpa's TV. If you tune in certain cable news outlets, you know, you're getting a fairly constant flow of occasionally propaganda, but certainly information that is aimed to influence your beliefs. Not to inform you, but information that is aimed to influence the way you think. And that's what they're hearing in the background. And if the only thing you hear at Mama's house all day is that Donald Trump's a terrible guy or Joe Biden's a terrible guy or whoever, after a while you start to believe Donald Trump, Joe Biden, terrible guy, because you hear it your whole life. And I didn't have that when I was a kid. I mean, certainly there would be people who came in our store who may not have liked Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon or Martin Luther King.
But that's different.
But that was, sometimes I'd look and like, consider the source, you know, I don't know if I want to be like that guy. But there was no one on television or radio telling me this. And the same thing goes with music. I mean, we had some, you know, I guess suggestive songs when I was a kid, things I didn't even understand at the time that now I know kind of what they meant and where they came from. But now there's no doubt. And you hear some of the things that are coming out of the car radio speakers at the red light next to you, and you're like, whoa, there's a kid in that car, you know. So yeah, somebody's got some challenges ahead of them to clean all this up.
I don't know how they're going to do that, but I think that you can get on Twitter and there'll be people there that say provocative things. I mean provocative as far as political wise, and they'll have a huge following. They'll have more people following them than followed, you know, Keith Whitley.
Well, and Kanye West is a good example now.
Exactly.
A guy who's a talented musician.
You mean Ye?
Ye.
Yeah.
Or Yee or whatever.
Yeah.
But, you know, he's a talented musician who has done some good work in his life. And I doubt he could make a buck these days by doing what would be called a traditional song. Whatever he does has to be outrageous. It has to be, you know, kind of pushing the envelope, making people angry, getting their emotions up. And that's sad. I mean, that in a long way, I've kind of tried to answer your question from earlier in that I don't know what the next thing is. I don't know if anybody these days can grab a guitar or a trumpet or some primitive instrument like that and create a melody with words that are attractive enough to, you know, capture somebody's attention. They've got to, now it's more like, you know, what sensational thing, you know, they can say.
Because that's, you said it right, attract their attention.
Now, Taylor Swift may be the exception to the rule. You know, she writes about all of her old boyfriends and all that, and she does it in a relatively harmless way, but there aren't many like that.
No, and I'm more of I don't know, I like country western and some little and some modern. I like all kinds of musics. But you're right, it's hard to see. I mean, when somebody can literally get on Twitter, make a statement, and have 40,000 likes and 50,000 retweets, there's no way Hank Williams Jr. would have met that many people.
It's true.
Or I guess the Bee Gees might have for a few years there. So maybe the new form of entertainment is your comments. That's because that's all they are, just comments.
And I'm guilty of that too. You know, and being in TV, we're encouraged to have a social media presence.
Sure.
And in my own life, I'll admit, I try to put things out there that will be liked and retweeted In my own case, sometimes I get too smart for my own good, and every once in a while I have to like walk back a little bit. But my goal is to say things or post things that people might consider informative, funny, clever, that they might feel like
And I
passing
call
on.
that provocative, provokes
Yeah, I mean,
a reaction.
because of my position and because also of just who I am, I'm not gonna, cross too many lines there. But if I see where, for example, a state or national politician has done or said something that I feel is just remarkable in a good way or a bad way, I'll usually post it without comment as something like, the representative from so-and-so's Northwest District weighs in on health care. And that person may have said something I thought was really fantastic, or might have said something that I thought was just incredibly awful. But I'd rather let other people look at it. I'm bringing it to their attention.
That's all you're doing.
And if they want to say, praise the Lord, that's fine. If they want to say, how did this person get elected, that's fine. But I just try not to be the person who decides that for them.
The way information and news and getting people to is really, I'm like you, I don't know where it's going, because nobody's going to pay to listen to the radio except unless you go to satellite and all of that. But the reality is they're just trying to get me to watch you, so I'll see that commercial, so I'll buy those gloves. On the courthouse square at 30 2nd Street is the law firm of Logan Thompson Law. Since 1965, they have served the legal needs for the good citizens of Cleveland-Bradley County. If you've got a problem, they're no problem. Give them a call. So, you have one thing that you have found or maybe it found you, but going to these local schools, that has been that's almost how some people are labeling you, right?
Oh, yeah, and I'm proud of that. During the pandemic, it's been tough. Before the pandemic, I could accurately say for about 25 years that I was in more schools during a school year than anybody except the guy who delivers the milk. Because I would generally try to hit about 150 a year, which comes out to almost one a day over a school year period. But 20 counties that we cover, and certainly never got into all of them in a particular year. But over my career, I've been in probably almost all of them by now. I guess the benefit of that for me has just been, it has really spotlighted the inequity, and there's no way to fix it. People have talked about it for decades, and they'll talk about it a few more decades. But it's just kind of sad when you look at the big picture to see that some students are zoned for and are attending schools that may have a fraction of the facilities, equipment, and opportunities than other schools do. And, in a perfect world, it'd be kind of like Walmart. You go into any Walmart, you're going to find all the things Walmart has. In schools, it's just not that way. And having grown up in a rural area in a high school that had low enrollment, not that many classes from which to choose, and occasionally visiting other schools for football games and things and going, wow, wouldn't it be nice to have that? Or, gee, they've got this. It's still that way today and probably always will be. But I have truly been fortunate enough to see that full spectrum of schools, from the poorest to the richest, from the oldest to the newest. And I just wish, if I won the lottery and could wave that magic wand, I'd try to figure out a way for all kids to have the opportunities that the best ones have.
Who else would be able to see all of those different levels of facilities and stuff? Would it be a bus driver, maybe the milkman, maybe as you saw
Somebody
it,
like that. I mean, the point is, if you're the superintendent of Hamilton County Schools, you've got 75 schools, and I guarantee you he's familiar with all 75. But is he familiar with all the private schools? Is he familiar with all the schools in Bradley, Polk, Dade, Murray, all the counties? No. And that's where I have the advantage of just being able to see and visit, all these places. And generally, I've had a kind of a welcome, open door policy. I've made enough good friends and contacts to where I can go. The things that have changed a little bit, of course, with the pandemic and safety, security, it's not like it was 5 or 10 years ago when you could literally go to the front door of any school, open the door, walk in, go to the office. Can't do that anywhere now.
You could go back then. You could go in there and sit down in the cafeteria and eat, and nobody might not even ask you what you're doing there.
Pretty much.
I mean,
and frankly, like at the times when I was growing up, there was no reason to be worried about what you would be doing there. I mean, I grew up in an area where the nearest law enforcement was 35 or 40 miles away, and you see Mayberry on TV. That's kind of like what we're talking about. I mean, there was. Not that long ago, in the scheme of history, not that long ago, there was a time where, you could leave a school door unlocked, wide open, let the fresh air in, the side doors, whatever. That's just the way it was. That's the way it was when I grew up. So I can still get into most schools, I suppose, but now, of course, you call ahead of time, you show your ID, all that sort of thing. And with the pandemic, for that 2-year period of when things were at its worst, and I don't mean to imply that it's over, hope it's over, but at least during the worst of what we've just experienced, I only went into maybe 2 or 3 schools a year for a couple of years just because I didn't really want to, and frankly, they didn't want me to go. They didn't want visitors. So I'm gradually trying to reestablish that and going into more schools and hoping we avoid whatever the next plague is. But it has been a great experience for me just being able to see that huge selection of schools.
Can you think of one interview report that you did that it just really disturbed you?
Yes. The most disturbing ever was a Thursday afternoon about 6 years ago, last month, November. So it would have been November of 16. Sometimes in a TV newsroom, you just have those moments where not much is going on. And then something happens and you just start appreciating that moment a few minutes ago when nothing was going on. That afternoon, we heard about a school bus wreck. And we hear about a school bus wreck few times a week, and most of the time they're minor. A bus has maybe run into a ditch or got rear-ended or whatever the case may be, and nobody's hurt. Damage to the bus, another bus comes and takes the students to school or to their homes or whatever. And on that day, we were hearing about one that apparently was pretty serious. There was a large police and rescue presence headed over in the Brainerd area, and it was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I guess, and I think my newscast started at 5 then. But it sounded serious enough to where we would need to do a live shot about it. And since I was sort of the school guy, they said, why don't you and this photographer go and set up a live truck and we'll take you live as we find out more about what's going on. And so I went over to the Brainerd area, and as soon as I got off Brainerd Road, I started seeing a large police presence, and I really wasn't even near where this accident was. And because some of the police officers and rescue people knew me, I think I was in my personal car, they let me get a little closer than they were letting most people get. And I was able to get near sort of the control center for what turned out to be a 6-fatality school bus accident at Woodmore, involving the Woodmore Elementary bus. But what stands out from that day was just the ashen faces of the superintendent, central office people, rescue people, None of them could say much because it had just happened, and we were just gradually getting information as to how bad this could potentially be. But then you started seeing parents and grandparents, a lot of crying, a lot of hysteria, and realizing, that I was a witness to this very personal, tragic moment that I had never experienced. I mean, I'd never covered a war, I'd never covered a mass shooting, I'd never covered anything involving multiple fatalities. And for someone who's been in the business as long as I have, that's rare. But that's just not been my beat, so to speak. I've never been a crime reporter or medical reporter. But that day, I was seeing up close and personal family tragedies at their most devastating.
Golly.
I mean, you're seeing these people literally just walking up a slight hill from where this bus was, and they had just learned that they had lost their baby. We're talking 5, 6, 7-year-old kids.
God.
And, and then you've got to go on TV and try to keep it together. You've got people 20 feet away from you who've lost their world, essentially, and a lot of others who are near you who still don't know. There's still that uncertainty as, is my baby one of them? Is my baby badly hurt? Did my baby survive? All these questions. Some of them are coming to me because they think I know everything because I'm the news guy. I don't know anything except, what little we've been able to pick up. But that was easily the most disturbing. And that's just one you'll never forget.
So that far trumped any other.
Yeah, as far as something that had a big impact on me, because I have led such a charmed life. I mean, my children are grown and healthy, and my parents lived to an old age, and didn't have any, say a sudden accident or anything that sidelined it. Just a blessed, charmed life, and so to have this front row seat to these young parents who are learning at that moment this horrible thing that just happened. I mean, that's tough. And then, to share that information on television live in a way that doesn't distort it, that doesn't sensationalize it. For instance, I shouldn't, another reporter from another media outlet was broadcasting heavily on rumors, and actually got on TV and said 12 children had died, which made it to the network of that affiliate, national and world. 12 children killed in Chattanooga bus wreck. Well, 6 is bad, which it turned out to be the correct number. But when it's 12, and again, you've got many parents and grandparents watching, getting information wherever they can. Well, now suddenly their mind, the chance that their child is one of them has just doubled.
Yeah.
And I think I even said on TV that day, you're hearing from some sources that 12 people have been killed. That's not what I'm hearing. If that's, we hope that's incorrect, and that's not the information that we've been given. We've confirmed that there are at least 5, but we don't believe it's 12. But when you've got rumors flying around and emotions going to the uppermost, that's tough. I hope I handled that well. I've gone back and looked at the tape and seen I could have done some things better, said some things better. And that's one of the challenges of this job, is that, when things are happening on the fly like that, you got to be very careful not to alarm people, not to distort or exaggerate or go from rumors. And it's just one of those, hopefully I'll get out of this business without having to report that again. That's a goal.
That haunts you, doesn't it?
It does. And just a year before that was the terrorist shooting there at the military recruiting headquarters in Chattanooga. And that was another one where, rumors were bouncing in a lot. And, these little phones that we carry around, I was getting tweets and texts and all sorts of things that were, I'm hearing this, I just confirmed that. And, you know, you're sitting there at the anchor desk and you just kind of, you know, I don't know if I can say this or not, you know, because I was starting to hear about these fatalities before it had been confirmed by anyone. And I can't go on TV and say, hey, a friend of mine who used to be a cop says that 5 military folks have been killed. Frankly, I trusted him, and it turned out to be true, but you can't do that. I just remember, and that was one of those also where that had the potential to really be inflammatory in that there were already suspicions that whoever was behind it might be a terrorist, and perhaps someone from a culture that many people frown upon. And you got rumors coming in. Well, it turns out that the guy was of Middle Eastern descent. But, I can't go on TV and say this is an attack of Islam or whatever.
Yeah.
You don't know. So there are so many touchy situations in that whatever you say on live TV might get picked up by your network and go worldwide.
It's true.
And then,
Why do they call it an anchor desk?
Good question. I don't know that I've ever, I guess that's
Supposed to be the anchor.
the guy that holds it down,
The guy that's you're supposed to be able to depend on the anchor.
Yeah.
Well, that's changed, hasn't it?
Well, now a lot of the people who some people consider anchors, I think, are opinion hosts.
Yeah.
And I've refused to call their channels news channels, and I've refused to call them news anchors. They are hosts, and they are sharing their opinions, and they admit it.
Yeah, it's not like they're hiding it.
Their own attorneys sometimes say you can't believe what.
It's just an opinion. We're just an opinion.
But people tend to believe it anyway. So.
What would be a typical Saturday night for David
For me?
Carroll? Yeah.
Oh gosh, boring.
Would you stay home or would you go out to eat?
No, my wife and I have been empty nesters for 10 years now. So we're watching movies. If the Braves are in season,
what kind of movies?
We like a lot of comedy. We like
Police Squad.
Yeah.
Monty Python.
Not into that necessarily, but there's so many streaming services now that have really well done shows. Some of which have been adapted from Britain, France.
Fawlty Towers.
Haven't gotten into that yet.
Boy, it's funny.
It's funny. But generally, we're looking for entertainment during baseball. We're Braves fans. For college football season, she likes Penn State. I like Alabama. So we're about to get into this 3-month window there where we've got to find some entertainment. But now, as far as a Saturday night, I'm not a Saturday night guy. Just stay at home, relax. Boring.
You're anything but boring.
I appreciate that.
David, you always wonder how people get where they're at and how so successful. And you have showed me that you got here by no accident.
You're very kind to say that. I've had an interesting career. I feel like I've succeeded in some areas. I have failed in others. But it's been, I wouldn't trade it for anything. I'm one of the few people that I know who is still doing essentially what I wanted to do when I was a kid. Was it TV news anchor? Not really, not at that time, but broadcasting. I just will always feel it's an admirable profession, and we do catch a lot of arrows from different people who think we're biased or who think we're one thing or another. But here's the thing, I've worked with hundreds of people in my line of work over this 35, 40-year career, and 99% of them are well-intentioned, hardworking, well-meaning. Do we make mistakes? Yes. We try to apologize for those mistakes and correct those mistakes. But day in, day out, I've never been told what to report. I've never been told, put this slant on this story. I've never been told, don't mess with this guy because he's an advertiser or a powerful politician or whatever it may be. I and my coworkers have had freedom to do the stories we want to do, report them the way they're supposed to be reported. And also, I feel like I've been given the freedom to put a little personality into it, try to put a little of myself into it where it's not just reading a script, but having the opportunity to communicate with people, talk to them, and not talk with them, not talk down to them, so to speak. I never liked the news anchoring style where someone is reading as if they're on top of a mountain looking down at the villagers. I mean, I want to have a conversation with people, and I've been given the opportunity to do it my way, and I'm really thankful for that.
You don't seem like the guy that would last long if you couldn't do that.
Probably not, just not me. But yeah, but I'm very fortunate, and my wife and I kid each other a lot because we have that relationship, and she, she'll just often say, "You are such a lucky so-and-so," and I'm like, guilty. I know. I'm living out my childhood dream, and hopefully can see it through.
Well, I hope this book is a success for you.
It has been. Thank you.
I mean, it is. It's all over the internet.
Mm-hmm.
I got it on Amazon. Is it at Wally's also?
Mm-hmm. East Ridge.
Do you eat there a lot too?
As often as I can, maybe once a month or so, something like that. So they're Friday. But that book has been a blessing. People like it. It's been a popular Christmas present this year and last year. And I'm hoping that book outlives me. I'm hoping that long after I'm gone, somebody digs that up, 40, 50 years from now and is like, man, whoever that old dude was, wrote a nice little history there that takes us back to 1900 and beyond. So.
Now, can you get this Wally's has them for sale then, right?
Right. And I have my own website where I can autograph them and mail them that way.
What's the website?
It is ChattanoogaRadioTV.com. And that's kind of lengthy, but I always tell people Chattanooga. Radio came before TV, so there you go. ChattanoogaRadioTV.com. And on that website, I have all three of my books, actually. The first one was a history of local broadcasting. The second one, The Volunteer Bama Dog, is kind of a comedy book. And then this one. And if there are any others in the future, they'll be there too. But I ship them out every day. And with this one, what's really been cool about this, I think I've sent some to every state because people who grew up in Chattanooga or the area and now live in Vermont or Nebraska or wherever, have gotten wind of it. And this kind of brings back memories for them of, thank you for doing this because I proposed to my wife at the Def Leppard concert at UTC Arena in 1988. And now I know
was
the
there.
date.
I believe I was there at that concert. Boy, that was a wild one, wasn't it? Was that the one I'm talking about? It was.
The most attended concert ever was ZZ Top. That's the record that still hasn't been broken.
I was at the Def Leppard one.
But
it was a good concert.
But that's been what has been the nice gift from this, has just been people around the nation kind of like having that piece of Chattanooga in their homes. That's nice.
Hello Chattanooga is a good name from it.
That was the easy part. I just thought, what's the first thing every concert artist says when they get on stage? Hello, Chattanooga. And I happened to find a picture for the cover that perfectly illustrates the duo for King and Country was at the Tivoli, and it looks like that's what they're saying when they're on the stage.
Do you get in the Tivoli free?
If
you come up there, will they say, come on in, David? Or what will they say?
They've been nice to me a couple times, yep.
If I go there, I sit on the very back row. The seats are better. I can see better and everything.
And just wait. They're doing a renovation of it now. And because the Tivoli is closed until sometime next year. See, here's the thing.
Why redo it? What's wrong with it?
It needs a lot of work that you don't see behind the scenes. And it'll be great. But Memorial Auditorium will be 100 April 2024. The Tivoli just hit 100 last year during the pandemic. So it really hasn't been celebrated yet. I think they'll get to it when it reopens. But between those two venues, 200 years of entertainment, again, from the early magicians and opera stars.
To the 1906 burning of the original.
Yeah, I think it was 1916, may have been it. But then there was...
They opened in 06.
Maybe that's what it was.
And burned in 16.
That's what it was. But, you look at Memorial Auditorium and you just realize, my gosh, they've had boxing, roller derby, basketball, skating,
Roller derby was big during that era, wasn't it?
and wrestling kept it open.
Because the floors were flat there, they could
Flat
do
floor.
that.
That's why they could do basketball and wrestling. And one of the things that comes up in the story about the auditorium in that book is it probably wouldn't be with us today had it not been for roller derby and wrestling. In the 50s, when TV came on, everybody held on to their money and said, why should I pay, to see, this singer who I can watch for free on my television? And wrestling and roller derby paid the bills for many years. So thank you, wrestlers.
Thank you, wrestlers. David, it's been an honor.
Thank you, sir.
I am
Nice
really,
to-
you're
very
one of
kind.
my wife's one of your biggest fans.
Well,